O holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Sarah Miles tells this story of this woman at a food pantry that she runs. Sarah runs this food pantry in San Francisco, and they feed hundreds of people every week. And they've been really good about making partnerships with area farms or local gardens to bring in all this fresh produce and all of these goods for folks. And she says one day, after they wrapped up the food pantry, she came outside and there was this woman who was standing at the bus stop. This is an older woman who was a regular at the food pantry, and Sarah knew her quite well, and so she started talking to her, and the woman said to her, I don't know how I'm going to even lift all of this food. So she had this big shopping cart, and it was filled with all of this produce and all of these goods that had come out of the bounty of the harvest that they had, all of this good, nutritious food for her. And she said, I don't know how I'm going to lift this. She had to get it onto the bus. And so and Sarah looked around, and she saw that there was only one other person who was there, and that was a new guy. He'd never really been to the food pantry before, but it seemed apparent that he had some sort of mental health issues. He was what she calls a mutterer, right? He was mumbling to himself and then kind of talking about things, and he had a little shifty and that kind of thing. And so she thought, well, I've got this guy, who knows what his capacities are, and myself, how are we going to get this done? And so the bus pulled up, and she asked this guy who was next to her if he would help lift it, and he did. And together they picked up this big grocery cart, and they got it on the bus, and the woman who was there, she was so thankful, and she expressed such gratitude for them, and she said, I just knew that God would send somebody to help. And when Sarah got home, she spoke to her spouse, and her spouse said, well, wouldn't it make more sense, right? If God had sent you and this guy with some mental issues, wouldn't it have made more sense for God to send a taxi cab to pick this woman up and to take her groceries back? Because she still has to be on the bus for an hour to get home, and then she's got to get her groceries off of the bus. So wouldn't it have just made more sense if God was involved in all this stuff to send a taxi? And I love that little story from Sarah because it is so much about what's happening in this feeding story in our gospel text today. When Jesus is teaching and he's healing people, people are very much attracted to that, and they come in these great big groups. And here in this gospel story, it's not even that Jesus is teaching, right? This is feeding 5,000 people is a story that shows up in every single one of the gospels. And John's is just a bit different. Jesus just shows up, and the crowds swarm him, right? Thousands of people come to see Jesus. And the first thing that Jesus does when he sees this crowd is he doesn't ask of them anything, right? He doesn't say to them, well, we need to hear a lesson from me, or you need to get in a line and do all this stuff. The first thing he does when he sees the crowd is he turns to one of his disciples. He turns to Philip, who we rarely hear from in the Gospels, and he turns to Philip and he says, what are we going to do to feed these folks, right? How are we going to buy the food to feed them, which is a bit of a setup, right? Because Jesus never buys the food to feed the folks, but he asks Philip the question that Philip is expecting. How are we going to buy the food to feed these folks? And what's Philip's response? Philip's response is, well, Jesus, that's a great question. I was hoping you would answer that one, right? He says it would take more than half a year's salary to feed these folks, and that wouldn't even feed them, right? He says more than half a year's salary worth of food wouldn't be enough for each person to even have a little bit. He said we couldn't even give them a snack with half a year's salary. There are thousands of people, Jesus. And so Jesus waits a second, And then all of a sudden, Andrew, right? Andrew pipes up and he says, well, you know, Jesus, there's this child over here who says they got 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And then Andrew does the same thing that Philip does. Andrew goes, but I don't know how that's going to help, right? That's ridiculous. Why is this kid coming to us? I hope you catch this detail that's in here that's really quite special. Jesus asks the disciples, how are we going to feed these folks? And the disciples' response is always, we can't. It's impossible, it doesn't make any sense, we don't have the money to do it, we don't have the resources to make it happen, we can't do it. But what I love, what's so special about this story is that as the disciples are repeating to Jesus, we can't, a child hears Jesus' request and comes forward with a basket of food. Now the child never articulates anything. We don't hear the child's voice at all in the story. But just think about what has happened. This kid comes forward with the basket of food and presumably to offer it to the disciples to use as food. The kid never looks at the crowd of 5,000 people and says, well, there's no way this is going to help, so I might as well not even bring it forward. The kid says, well, Jesus, can you do anything with this? And he does. We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish, and only have so little, and yet the crowd's needs are met. And more than that, right? I mean, it says that everybody gets enough. They get what they want. Not even just what they need, they get what they want out of this food. And then we're told that there are fragments left over from the feast, right? There are pieces, and there are enough pieces to fill 12 baskets. The child came with 1 basket, and they walked away with 12. Now, I don't know about you, but that tells me that somewhere along the line there was a solution to this problem that nobody was willing to think about. Way back in the 1700s, 1736, John Wesley, who was the sort of founder of Methodism, right, was heading from England to the Americas. He was going to the Georgia colony, right? This is before the United States became a nation. These are colonies, and John was going to travel to Georgia to do some preaching and to gather some people in. And so he gets on this boat from England. And suddenly, somewhere in the Atlantic, this big storm whips up in the middle of the sea. And it's a bad storm, right? The waves are crashing up against the ship. Water is coming over onto the decks, and it's dripping down the sides. And people inside are terrified. The sails are tearing. And John is writing about this in his journal. And something piques his interest in the middle of the storm, and that is this little group of Germans who are sitting in one section of the boat, and while everybody else is screaming, all the English folks are screaming and tearing their hair out over this, you have this little group of Germans who are just sitting quite still, and they're just chatting with one another and praying with each other, and they appear to be quite calm. And this intrigues Wesley, and so he goes over and he asks them who they are and what they're about. And little does John know, but he's traveling on this boat with this sect of this piety faith, these folks who are from a faith called Moravian Christians, and it's this little group that predates Martin Luther's Reformation, right? Predates the Lutheran Church. These folks that wanted to take a look at the way that God was calling us to be active in the world and calling us to be each other. And it's this group of people, and so he's so impressed with them, or he's so intrigued by them, that when he gets to Georgia, he goes to eat with them, he goes to stay with them. And this group of folks, they welcome him in and they invite him to a feast. They invite him to this feast, and it's really simple. They bring out some bread, and they bring out some water, and they share prayers with each other, and they share stories with each other about how God has been moving in their lives, the things that they're thankful for, the places of hurt. They're explaining to each other where God is active in their world. And this is a transformative experience for John. He spends a lot of time with these folks while he's in Georgia and even back in England. But he noticed something about the way that they shared a meal together. Their meal wasn't just routine. It wasn't something that you just put together, you put out on a table. And I don't know about you, but when we do meals, I can tell you right now, I'm going to admit this, and Mallory's going to hate me for it, but when we sit down for a meal, we have a dining room table, but we usually sit in front of the TV. Who sits in front of the TV and eats their dinner? There we go. All right. Yeah, y'all do that, right? So we get together, and that's our ritual. We sit down in front of the TV to eat, but there is something missing about that, right? And it's entertaining, sure, but there is a connection that is lost there. And this Moravian experience, what they were doing when they were breaking bread is they were inviting John into a relationship. They were inviting him into a different way of communicating. They were inviting him to have a revolution of the Spirit. That the food might point to something deeper in their lives. We might just begin to change the world by even thinking about how we do food, how we sit down at the table together, what the meal means. Rather than the meal just being a way to fill our stomachs, maybe we need to listen to the grumbling that happens before the meal, to get in tune with something a bit deeper. Those folks on the boat and this crowd that's gathered before Jesus, they remind me of a feeling. And that feeling is in many ways fear. Right? The crowds rush to Jesus, hoping to be healed, hoping to be transformed, hoping that Jesus might reach out and touch them. Right in the text it says that they had seen the miraculous signs that Jesus had done among the sick. They are there because they believe that they will be healed. And the first thing that Jesus does when he sees them is he thinks about feeding them. He thinks about offering to them a meal, bringing them to the table, having that connection. Because he recognizes that there's something happening deep within them, and something that hunger does to us. It elicits this grumble within. And more often when I hear texts like this preached, we talk about the miracle that happens where everybody's fed, or we talk about Lazarus when he's raised from the tomb, and that's all very exciting stuff. But the thing about each of the miracles that Jesus performs is that they don't solve the problem. The next day, each and every single one of these 5,000 people, they will be hungry again. Lazarus, though he's raised from the tomb, he will die again. And so often we want our miracles to be permanent. So often we want these miraculous little signs to be things that last forever, that solve all of our problems, that take away the grumble, that take away that pain. Because the thing that we're really worried about isn't so much the end, but the part that leads to it. I was listening to a story about a guy who deals with folks who are at the end of their lives. And he says that most people, what they're really afraid of, they're not afraid to die. He said what they're afraid of is the suffering that leads to death. We fear that grumble. We fear that deep need within us. We fear it because it means that we're helpless, that something needs to be done. And if we can't feed ourselves, if we can't resurrect ourselves, if we can't heal ourselves, we are terrified. Because we need to rely on somebody else to make that happen. And Jesus knows this, and he looks out at the crowds, and he turns to Philip, and he says to him, how are we going to feed these folks? Our desire would be to not deal with the grumble. Our desire would be to not deal with the suffering or with the pain, because it's easier to pretend that the problem is not the suffering, but it's something else. It's really easy for Philip to pretend that the problem is not that the folks are hungry, but that we have no way of feeding them. When the reality that Jesus points to is that the problem isn't that we don't have any way to feed them, the problem is that we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to deal with the suffering. We don't want to deal with the emptiness or the brokenness or the pain. And we see this play out when Jesus speaks to his disciples about what's coming next for him. Jesus will talk to them about the cross, and he'll tell them that I have to die. I will have to die and be raised in 3 days. 3 days later, I will be raised. And Peter, this disciple that's always put on the top of everything, the one that seems to be the spokesperson for the rest of the disciples, always comes to Jesus and he says, no, Jesus. Peter rebukes Jesus as Jesus tells him that he's going to have to die. We fear that brokenness. We fear that suffering and pain. But what's so beautiful about this story is that we don't have to. The child approaches with a basket of 5 loaves and 2 fish. And at the end of the feast, Jesus tells his disciples to gather the fragments. There will be a way to continue eating tomorrow. The fragments are important. We don't have to go to waste. And tomorrow when our need resurfaces, when the hunger comes back, when that grumble begins, the fragments are there after this feast. And the words of Jesus will linger for us in that moment. As we think about where the source of our life comes from. We will not live by bread alone. There is enough for all, even when the disciples can't see it. This is the same problem we come up against when we do work as the church. What we lack. We see lack when God offers plenty. We see what isn't when God calls us to what is. We hear the grumbling and we find the problem, and God hears the grumbling and finds a connection, finds a way to bring life. At the end of that story from Sarah Miles, she says that what she realized after speaking with her spouse was that it's not that God needed to send a taxi. God had already sent some folks. And she suspects it might be that Jesus has a sense of humor in sending her and this guy with some mental health issues to help this poor woman. But what she says is that Jesus is right here with us, the lowly and the unprepared, among the weak, the faithless, the doubting, as his disciples proved then and now. He doesn't look for the most religious the most doctrinally correct, or for that matter, the smartest of his beloved people to build his kingdom, but hands over authority to anyone willing to suspend self-doubt and simply trust Jesus' faith in us. My prayer for us this week as we go forth is that when we would pay attention to the grumble of our sin. That we would not fear that emptiness, that we would not fear that pain or that suffering, but that we would know and believe that Jesus is with us. And that when we hear those things and when we observe those things in the world, what we are observing is an opportunity that God has provided to connect, to reach out, to bless, to join in a partnership, to make real transformation happen. To sit down at a feast of love together. Go forth and be blessed in that grace, be surrounded by it, swim in it, drown in that grace this week. And pay attention to the stomachs that grow. Amen.